Okay. This is really hard to explain, but I'll try to, instead of trying to explain things, I'll just show what the problem is, or the effect that I'm trying to resolve. Uh, so this classic sampler plugin, this Blockhead has this plugin based architecture, right? So we have all these plugins. So this classic, when you hot switch between these samplers, you're hot switching between different DLLs essentially. So they're called .blink files, but they're essentially DLLs. I don't know why they're associated with 7-zip. That's weird. You can open DLLs in zip. I don't know why my computer has them associated with a zip manager, but these are basically DLLs, just renamed to .blink. Okay. So this classic thing that I have set up here, this is this DLL here, and because it's a sampler, I can hot switch to any other sampler DLL, so I can switch to fudge, and now it's using this one, for example. And both of these plugins have this pitch parameter, so I can input pitch information here, and then I can hot switch to classic. And even though it's a completely different DLL that's handling this block now, the modulation data remains, because this modulation data it's not stored against the parameter of the plugin. All it's stored against is a unique identifier. So both of these plugins happen to have a pitch parameter with the same ID. And so the modulation data is stored against that ID within this block instance. So when you switch plugin, I'm throwing away all of these parameters that I have for this plugin, and I'm generating new parameters. But when I get to the point of generating this new pitch parameter here, I'm noticing that I already have envelope data stored against this ID. So it's just reusing it, because the data doesn't go away. It's just stored inside the block. So even if you switch, for example, if you have a low pass filter, if you have like frequency information here, you can, because this is just a generic effect, but you can switch to a plugin that doesn't even have a frequency parameter like this. But then you can switch back to a plugin that like a high pass this time instead of low pass. I go to high pass and go to frequency, and the old modulation data is still there. So again, we're switching between DLLs here. We're switching between different plugins, but the modulation data is can be shared between them in this way, because. And when I say the modulation data is stored against the ID rather than, I'm not saying it's stored against like the pitch parameter or something like that. It's just stored against an ID. The host doesn't know what this parameter is. The only thing the host knows is an ID, which has this envelope data stored against it. And it says pitch here, but from the host's point of view, that is just that's just a sequence of 5 characters. That's pitch. The host doesn't know what pitch is. Everything about the concept of pitch is handled by the plugin itself. And in the case of like the classic sampler and the fudge sampler, for example, they deal with the concepts of pitch in different ways because they implement the DSP in different ways. But they happen to, in the terms of like presenting this envelope to the user, all of that is handled by the plugin as well. But I've just set things up so that there's a lot of consistency between the classic and fudge implementations of this envelope. So it basically looks the same when you switch between. But there's no reason why they have to look the same. There's no reason, for example, why when you switch to this pitch parameter, You can see you can set like a min and max for the values, but when you open it for the first time, it has this min slider has a default of -24, and the max slider has a default of max of +24. Those defaults are specified by the plugin, and the Classic and Fudge, just for consistency, they specify the same defaults, but there's no reason why those defaults need to be the same. They could differ between different plugins. If it makes sense for example, for the defaults to be like -12, +12, for example, if somebody adds a new sampler plugin in the future, or a new synthesizer or whatever, or a new effect that happens to have like a resonator, which happens to have a pitch parameter, there's no reason why they have to use -24, 24, +24, because that's not dealt with by the host. This is all dealt with individually by the plugins. So there's a lot of consistency right now just because I wrote all of the plugins and I decided, yeah, I'll always just use 24 for the min and max. Okay, that's a bug. They should default to -24 +24 when you double click. Let's make a note of that. It's because I refactored the parameter system very recently, so I'm still finding all these little bugs. Right. So just for clarity, when I say that the host doesn't know anything about the concept of pitch, all it knows is this parameter data is being stored against a particular unique identifier. The unique identifier I'm talking about is in the header of the plugin API. This is just temporarily the way that I've set things up at the moment, just for simplicity. I have all of these standard parameter types, which are just IDs. So these are the IDs that are shared between the plugins for expressing these parameters. And that is literally the only point of synchronization between the plugins, is one plugin can create a parameter which has this ID, and then another plugin can create a parameter which has the same ID. And then the host will just automatically notice these when it loads the plugins at startup. The host will just automatically notice that these two plugins they both have a parameter with this same ID. It doesn't know anything about what this ID means. It just knows that the ID is the same between the two plugins. And so it will associate the parameters together for the purposes of hot switching between different plugins like this, and having the modulation data stay, and also adding manipulators which can affect this plugin concept. It can affect it on different plugins. So it's generated this like manipulator target, which this is like, if you hover over it, it will list all of the plugins that have a parameter with this ID. And so when you create a manipulator in the current version of Blockhead, if you create a manipulator for pitch, it's adding it to this this group called voice, and you see in these blocks that I have here, this pitch parameter is not in a group called voice, because some parameters can be in groups like these. For example, there's this noise group, for example. So what's going on there? The reason that's happening is because the Burke plugin has a pitch parameter, and it happens to put it into a group called voice. And so what's happening is, during startup, when the plugins are being scanned and I'm looking at all of the parameters and grouping them together and generating these manipulator targets, Out of sheer chance, on Windows at least, the first plugin that is scanned and loaded, which happens to have a pitch parameter, in the current version of Blockhead, the first one, I think it's happening alphabetically. Is it? No, it's not happening. No, it's not happening alphabetically. Maybe reverse alphabetically. In fact, it might happen. What is the term for opposite of alphabetical? Anti-alphabetical. I think it's loading the plugins currently in reverse alphabetical order, but essentially it's random. Like the order in which the host loads the plugins shouldn't matter at all. It's basically just random, or it should be random. It shouldn't matter anyway what order the plugins, but currently it does matter because when we generate these manipulators, we have to decide how to represent this envelope. And again, the host doesn't know anything about the concept of pitch, so it has to look into at least one of these plugins to figure out how to represent this pitch envelope. Like, for example, you see it's generating grid lines here, and it's marking out these octaves, -12, +12, because those are interesting values for the concept of pitch. That information is being gotten from the plugins, and specifically it's generating this target envelope from the Burk plugin in this instance, simply because the Burk plugin happened to be loaded first. So that's where it's getting the information about this to present this envelope to the user. We have to get it from at least one of the plugins. So this has been like a long-running design issue where so right, the only difference, because I wrote all these plugins myself, and I was very consistent about the way that the pitch envelope on each of these plugins was set up. The only difference at the moment is that with Burk plugin, the pitch parameter is put into this group called voice, and because it's loaded first, that's what the manipulator does as well. But the point is that these parameters are only associated together by an ID, and literally anything about them could be different between plugins. For example, the min and max values, the default min and max, that kind of thing. The way that the values are converted to a string, like for example, when I hover over the line, you can see it's presenting it as a string representation. The way that happens, for example, the way these grid lines are set up, that could be different from plugin to plugin. Generally, I mean, for all of these standard blocks, the standard plugins, generally I'd prefer to make things consistent between them. But the point is that they don't need to be. And so the only example I have of that at the moment, or the most obvious example, is the fact that the pitch parameter is put into this voice group. And so when you create a manipulator with pitch, it also creates this voice group, which is just a little bit weird at the moment. But the reason it does that is because the Burk plugin is loaded first, and so it's using the Burk plugin as like a basis for generating these manipulator envelopes. It's different for each manipulator target. So for this width envelope, for example, it's just going to I don't know what plugin it's using to generate this envelope, but it would be whichever plugin was loaded first, which has a parameter, this width parameter, with the width ID, which would be noise width, this one here. So it's actually this ID. So again, the way this list is populated as well. Again, the host doesn't know what this sequence of 5 characters PITCH means. again, it's getting that from the Burk plugin. It's getting that sequence of characters. So you can even have, I mean, you could theoretically create a plugin which uses this pitch ID, but it doesn't even call it pitch. It doesn't call it PITCH. You could call it anything you want. You could call it like my amazing pitch parameter or something like that. And if it happens to be loaded first, then that's what the manipulator block would use. Instead of this string, it would say my amazing pitch parameter, and then it would just use that one as a basis. So anyway, that's not ideal. The fact that it just takes the first loaded plugin as a basis for generating these manipulator targets. One of the problems is, obviously this is very early to think about this right now, but in the future, if you have like third-party developers creating their own plugins, third-party developers, there's no reason to use one of these standard parameters. You can just declare your own parameters. You could just generate your own unique identifier for your own unique parameter, and just have the plugin declare, I have a parameter with this ID. So you have a parameter called Twizzle or something like that. You just generate a new ID for it. Just declare to the host that you have that parameter, and here's how the parameter works. Here's the min and max envelope values. Here's how to represent the value as a string. Here's how you set up the grid lines. Here's the sequence of characters that represents the parameter. What's the default value, for example? All of this stuff. You just declare that to the host, and then a second third party developer could come along and say, "Oh, I saw that developer they released that plugin with that Twizzle parameter, with that unique identifier. I want to also use a Twizzle parameter in my plugin because it makes sense for my plugin. So I'll just use that same ID in my plugin, and then the host will automatically, when it loads those two plugins, even though they're from completely separate third-party developers, if those two developers coordinate with each other to use the same ID for that parameter, then the host will automatically set things up so that you can hot switch between, like if it's the same type of plugin, like if they're both effect plugins or both synth plugins, then you'll be able to hot switch between those two plugins and not lose the modulation data. For example, you'll be able to do this. And also the host will generate manipulator targets which can target both of those plugins simultaneously, even though they were created by separate developers. Okay, so the problem is, again, if we use pitch as an example, or let's not use pitch as an example. So the first developer could create a parameter called Twizzle, and then when users load that plugin up, try to target it with a manipulator, because it's the only plugin that has a parameter with that ID. The manipulator is just going to look into that plugin to generate the envelope information and whatever, and present the information to the user. Then a third-party developer could create another plugin with that same ID. There's nothing stopping them from just creating a plugin that has a parameter with that same ID, and they could just name the plugin A, for example, so that the host loads it first alphabetically. And then that would force the host to use that plugin instead for manipulator targets. And that might cause confusion because you have one plugin and you're modifying it using a manipulator maybe, and the manipulator looks and feels a certain way. And then you install another plugin, and then suddenly your manipulator looks different. simply because this new plugin was loaded first during startup. So that is a problem which I've been thinking about for about 2 years. It's just I've thought about like there's like 20 different ways that you could deal with that problem. Most of the like technical solutions do not work. The technical ideas that I had for potential solutions to that problem don't actually make any sense once you think them through. And then I also thought of like technical / business solutions to that problem. Like you could have like for like one thing you could do is you could just say, okay, these are the standard parameters. These are the only ones that are allowed to be shared between plugins. So if you're a third-party developer and you create if you create a plugin with a custom parameter, then it's just not going to be shared between other plugins. That's not an ideal solution. What an extension of that might be that I have like a centralized, like I would be like an authority over a centralized repository of standard parameters, and third-party developers would have to appeal to me as an authority to like upgrade their custom parameters to standard parameters, and then like in the next version of Blockhead they would be added as standard parameters or something, and then they would work like they would work on their own, but they wouldn't be able to be shared or manipulator targets generated. But then, you know, a new version of Blockhead would come out, and there'd just be this like this ever increasing list of standard parameters. That's not a very good solution. I don't like the idea of being an authority, having any kind of authority figure who's in control of this like this plugin standard or whatever. I think that's stupid. Anyway, I thought of many different solutions. The only one that I can think of that actually works and makes sense and isn't terrible is the following. I'm going to have the concept of a reference plugin for manipulator targets. So I think the way it's going to be presented is when you right click on one of these buttons, this context menu pops up, which at the moment all you can do is remove. But I think what I'll do is I'll add something to this context menu. It's going to look kind of like, I'll add something to the context menu that what am I doing? It will say something like reference plugin, and then the name of the plugin that it's. So at the moment it's Burk. Reference plugin. So you can right click, open the context menu, and say reference plugin Burk. So that'll show you which plugin this manipulator target is using as a reference to present this this envelope for editing. And then this would be how do I do this? No. How do I do it? Oh, come on. And then there'll be a sub menu that you can open. See, little arrow. I'm trying to draw an arrow. So you could open this sub menu, and then there would be a list of all of the plugins here that have this pitch parameter. And you could just select the one that you want to use as the reference plugin for this parameter for the manipulator. That is it's not a perfect solution. It is the best solution that I have come up with so far for this problem. So it basically offloads the problem to the user and then, okay, there's another thing we could do, which is in the settings, we could have some kind of like plugin management page where you can choose your defaults for which plugin should take precedence when it comes to because this doesn't solve the problem of like the default at the moment is Burk because it was loaded first. So there could be another thing in here, plugin management or whatever, where you can choose parameter by parameter what plugin should take precedence over the other plugins for the purposes of creating manipulators. Okay. Also, what I want to do is for these standard parameters. So this solution that I've given here, it doesn't actually solve this problem of when you create a manipulator at the moment, it puts it into this voice group for pitch. It puts the pitch parameter into this voice group. It doesn't actually solve that. It would still do that even if you had this ability to switch away from it, switch the reference parameter. Because Burk is still being loaded first, and so it still has to choose one to use as a default. Yeah, so what I want to do is when you create a plugin that has a parameter that uses one of these standard parameters. At the moment, the plugins will always they're always required to declare everything about the plugin, about everything about the parameter. So, for example, if you have a plugin that has a pitch parameter, the plugin is required to tell the host absolutely everything about how to present this this parameter. So it has to tell it again the default min max, the how to convert the value to a string, these grid lines, all of this stuff, and also what the name of the parameter is. But I still want to have the ability to just override any of those things if you want to. If it doesn't make sense to have -24 plus 24 as the min and max, for example, just have the plugin do whatever it wants. But I want to change it so that the plugin has the option to just say, okay, I'm using this standard parameter. I don't want to change anything about it. I just want to use whatever the default is for the standard. The point is like they're standard parameters, so the host should have a set of defaults for these standard parameters, which it currently doesn't. The host doesn't know anything about these standard parameters. All it knows is the IDs, and the plugins just tell the host what the IDs mean. But the fact that these are standard parameters means the plugin should be able to just say, okay, I want to use the standard amp parameter, and I'm not going to bother telling you anything about what that means. You should just know already. The host should know what this means. So the host should have all of the standard, like the defaults for this amplitude parameter, for example. It should just know about them. And so the plugin should just be able to say, yeah, give me the default amp parameter and you deal with it. I don't want to tell you anything about it. I'm not overriding anything about it. I'm not changing the name. I'm not changing any of the defaults. Just give me the default. So that would simplify plugin creation a lot. Don't know why it crashed. I will have to investigate this. What happened here? I don't want to close this because I'm going to investigate this afterwards. But yeah, I completely lost my train of thought because Blockhead crashed. What even happened here? There's no manipulated target with 99. Block MIPS. I wonder what happened there. I was like adding and removing manipulators, so... I don't know how to... I don't know what happened. Size 3. Completely lost my train of thought. End of video.